Hi everyone, it's Caroline here, and this video is going to be about answering the how useful is a source question. Now, this one's only going to be for Edexcel, so if you do AQA, I will do a separate one for you. So, although the question comes up in both exam board papers and the wording of the question is the same, the type of sources they use is actually quite different. So, how you would answer it is going to be quite different, which is why I've divided the videos into one for Edexcel, one for AQA. So if you are Edexcel, you are actually going to do this twice. You're going to do it once in paper one, where you talk about your historic environment, so the end of the paper one. So that will either be on Whitechapel, if you're doing Crime and Punishment Through Time, World War One, London in World War Two, or Notting Hill. So whichever one of those you've chosen, it's then going to come up again in paper three for your depth study. So that will either be Russia, 1917 to 41, Germany in the 1920s and 30s, China under Mao, or America 1954 to 75. So whichever option you are doing. So because it comes up twice, overall it's 16 marks, which is an awful lot. It's the same as one of those really big essay questions. So it's really important we are getting these questions right. And I'm going to show you how best to answer them. So the question will always be, how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into something? So inquiry just means that if you were going to do a project into something, you were going to do an investigation into something. Maybe for homework, I was like, go away and do a project on World War One surgery, something like that. How useful would these sources be if you were doing that? So for Edexcel, we don't directly compare. You can almost treat them as two separate questions. So a 4 mark on how useful is source A, and then a complete separate 4 mark how useful is source B. So we don't ever directly compare them. So you're not saying source A is better, source B is more useful than A, anything like that. But what's really important is we just keep saying how useful. So the phrase, it is useful, it's not useful, needs to be in there time and time again. So the first thing you're going to do in the exam with your highlighter, you are going to highlight what the inquiry is focusing on. So in the first bullet point, what is X? So how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into surgery in World War One or the use of X-rays in World War One. You're going to highlight the inquiry focus, and then on the paper, you're going to highlight in the source anything that is relevant. So in the exam, the papers are yours to play with. You can scribble over them, you can highlight them. And the reason we do this is Edexcel can sometimes be quite mean with their sources. And what I mean by that is they will give you a source that's 3 paragraphs long, but actually the topic you're supposed to be focusing on only appears at the end of the third paragraph. So there will be potentially lines of that source that aren't relevant to this question. And there's a danger that you then start to use those, you quote them, you refer to them. That's not what the question is. So just make sure you are really focusing in on what that inquiry is. So how we're going to do this, we're going to remember the acronym COP. So we're going to COP our useful questions. So that stands for content. What is in the source? So if it's picture or drawing, what is it a picture or drawing of? So if you had to explain it or describe it to someone who couldn't see it, what would you say? If it's a written source, it's literally just what does it say? What are the words that it says? You've got to bring in your own knowledge, and this is often something that is the downfall of some students is putting in that own knowledge, especially if you want to get into that very top level. You have to use your own knowledge to judge the source. You need to look at the provenance of the source. So that's all the information they give you about it. So who wrote it, when, why, things like that. And then the final one is the purpose. Why did the photographer take that picture? Why did the artist draw that picture? Why did the author sit down and write what they wrote? So in this video, I'm just going to focus on the first two. I'll do one on provenance and purpose in a bit, but for the moment, we're just going to look at the content of the sources. So how useful are sources? Just looking at what the content. So the first question we're going to ask ourselves, how much does it tell us? So say we're doing an inquiry into Hitler and his speeches. So that's what our focus is. What can the source tell us about Hitler and his speeches? So we think to ourselves, does it give us a lot of information? Does it not give us a lot of information? Does it maybe tell us a lot about one aspect, but not very much about the others? So I put this source here. This is appeared in one of the Edexcel papers a little while ago. So our car set out for the first stadium. I waited outside the stadium, so I did not hear Hitler's speech, but I could hear thunderous applause from the crowd. Afterwards, we set off for another meeting. Hitler was making a total of 3 speeches that day. At the Berlin Stadium, the stands were packed with people and more were waiting outside. Hitler was very late, but the crowd had still waited for hours. A roar of applause burst out when the crowd heard that Hitler was on his way. So if you imagine you knew nothing at all about Hitler's speeches, what could you get from this? So obviously I can get from this that his speeches are very popular. So the author says he could hear thunderous applause from the crowd. I can also tell that Hitler makes a lot of speeches. On this particular day, he's making 3 at different places. And I can also tell that Hitler's very popular. So it says about the crowd had still waited for hours. Roar of applause bursts out when they hear that he's on the way. So his speeches are very popular. People are prepared to wait for hours to hear his speeches. So it doesn't tell me what was in his speech. But just be a bit careful with going down the road of what it doesn't tell us. Because don't forget, these are quite short sources. There's only so much we can expect it to tell us. So maybe I'd mention in passing, I'd say, although the source does not say what's in Hitler's speeches, which isn't particularly useful, it is useful in that it tells us that they were very popular. People would wait for hours. They were greeted with applause. He made a lot of them that day. And I'd probably word it like that. So I'd kind of list it. So you don't need to go into too much detail, but just summing up how much information it can tell us. So that's the first thing. We're going to look at how much it covers. So here's another one. This is from World War One. This is a base hospital that's been set up for a visit of the king that's coming to visit. So how much does it tell us? Well, it tells us that the hospital's quite rough and ready. We can see they've got what looks like blood or IV drips that's hanging from the ceiling. We can see there are nurses. We can see that there are patients, some of whom are sitting up in bed. They're looking at the camera. So it gives us a nice overall image of what a hospital would look like. So again, I'm not going to go down the route of what it doesn't tell us because it's a picture. There's only so much a picture is going to be able to tell you. But as an image, I can see there are nurses. I can see there are patients in beds. I can see it's not a building that's designed for being a hospital, but it's been put to that use. So all in all, it's useful because it tells me things about what hospitals were like in World War One. So the next thing we're going to look at is the information it tells you true? Is it accurate? And this is where your own knowledge comes in. So your own knowledge has to be something you cannot get from the source. So if, for example, I said, from my own knowledge, I know that Hitler often made 3 speeches a day, they wouldn't count that because they're like, well, it says that in the source. It also can't be something that you can guess from the source. So I couldn't say, from my own knowledge, I know that Hitler was very popular, because the fact that he's getting thunderous applause implies that anyway. So it has to be specific facts that you put in to show the examiner that you knew about this before you read the source. So before you saw the exam, you already knew that Hitler's speeches were popular. So maybe I'd say about how in the very early days, the Nazi Party is very small, but it grows due to Hitler's speeches. Maybe I talk about how the Nazis were very careful to tailor their speeches to individual locations, what it was that people wanted to hear, so that Hitler's speeches were well received, something like that. So, from all that knowledge, reading the source, it's accurate. So, from my own knowledge, it fits with what I know. Same again from this one. From my own knowledge, I know that hospitals were often set up in abandoned buildings, in schools, places that have been evacuated. So the source is useful because it's accurate. So from my own knowledge, I know that there are Queen Alexandra nurses that are sent out to the front. So something I couldn't get from the source. So specific fact that shows the examiner I absolutely know my stuff, and I'm using those facts to judge whether or not this is accurate. So from the knowledge that I've learned about this topic, I can tell that what is in the source is accurate, and that makes it useful. And then the last thing we're going to look at is how typical it is. Now, this is something students often don't do. So this is a way of showing off to the examiner, to flagging up that you are a student who really knows their stuff, who's worthy of those absolute top marks. So by typical, we mean normal. So something can be truthful, but not necessarily normal. So the first one I've given you is a really typical source. It's really normal. So if you were going to follow Hitler around on a day when he's making speeches, would you expect to see what happened in the source? Well, absolutely. It's typical. So we know Hitler's speeches might be met with thunderous applause, and that's quite normal. If we look at this one, though, if you remember, I said this is a hospital that's preparing for a visit from the king. So actually, this isn't typical. This is not a normal day for them. And you can imagine if you are working in a hospital and you know the king is coming to visit, you're going to put effort on, aren't you? You're going to make a bit of a show. So you make sure everything's spotless. You make sure all the uniforms are spotless and brand new. You know, you make sure that everything is looking the very best it is. So you could say, from the source, it shows the hospital looks very well run, very well organized, very clean. However, this is not a typical day. They're expecting a visit from the king. So that makes it less useful. So there's 3 things we're going to look at when we look at what's in a source. Does it cover everything we would expect? How much detail does it actually give you? Is the information accurate? So using your own knowledge to judge. And then the final one to get into those really, really top marks, is it typical? Is it a normal thing? If it is, it's useful. If it's not, perhaps it could be less useful.